who I'll be introducing properly later. Now, let me kick off this meeting by doing a bit of framing based on results for the Social Progress Index. But before we do, let's just have a quick bit of fun for those who are in the meeting, is just drop in the chat, say who you are and where you're from, and maybe tell us what the weather is or what you had for breakfast or something. So here I am in the chat. This is Michael in rainy London. So do tell us who you are and what you're doing at the moment, just to say hello. Always nice to see who's watching from different places around the world in these kind of meetings. There's Luke in Chile, DC, Washington, DC. Good morning, Luke. Sunny El Salvador joining us. We've got Seattle, Carl in Seattle, Rotterdam, Vildana, welcome. Excellent, lovely to see you all here. Rainy San Sebastian. I guess that's Susanna, that's kind of what we expect at this time of year. Great. Thank you for joining us, and more people coming in as we speak. So as I said, just to kick us off and frame a bit of this conversation, I want to share you a little bit of information about what we found from the Social Progress Index about these challenges of inclusive and sustainable growth for Europe. So let me just share my screen and pop up a bit of information that we have here. So just, I'm sure many of you know, but just for background, the Social Progress Index is a comprehensive measure of the quality of life of people in the society. The key thing about Social Progress Index is we exclude economic indicators. So we're trying to directly measure the real things that matter to real people, not through economic proxies. So we're asking sort of essentially three fundamental questions. Does everyone have their basic needs of survival met? Food, water, shelter, safety. Secondly, we're asking, does everyone have the foundations of well-being? Access to basic knowledge, access to information, health, and a good quality environment. And finally, does everyone have opportunity in terms of rights, freedoms, inclusiveness, and access to advanced knowledge? So this is the basic sort of piece of DNA of a Social Progress Index, that it doesn't look like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but very much maps onto the same underlying concepts. So the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN are really reflected in the Social Progress Index. And of course, the Sustainable Development Goals reflect a consensus about the kind of world, the kind of societies that we're trying to build. And in the Social Progress Index, we then go off and we find a whole bunch of different data points to measure these underlying concepts. So we take 53 different indicators, carefully selected and weighted, outcome indicators only. And that way we can measure the progress of 168 countries around the world. And we've also got time series to see how they've been doing over the last 10 years. So that's the Social Progress Index. What does it tell us about the EU? Well, if we aggregate for the EU as a whole, sorry, let me go backwards, for the EU 27 countries, what we see is that in the last 10 years, there has been progress. So the EU has gone from a score of 84.75 in 2011 to a score of 87.1 in the last few years. So in 2021. So there is progress occurring. It seems to have slowed a bit. It was faster in the first 5 years of this period than the last 5 years, but there is progress happening. What we see as well is that kind of progress is uneven. So what I've done here is I've broken out the Social Progress Index into its 12 components, and we can see where the EU is improving fastest and where it's improving not at all. So maybe starting with the good news is what we see is that in the area of access to information and communications, there's been a lot of progress over the last 10 years. And that reflects a pattern that we see all around the world, that access to the internet, mobile phones, online governance, etc., has really improved access for people to information. That's just a fact that we've seen around the world, and EU countries have benefited from that as well. We then see there are areas like access to advanced education, health and wellness, where there's been some solid progress. I think also it's a bit sort of slower around things like nutrition and basic medical care, water and sanitation, where EU countries are already at very high levels. But I think there's two very striking findings in this data. First of all, that in shelter, the EU has gone backwards in the last 10 years, driven largely around issues about affordability of housing. And then the other area where we've seen EU countries move backwards has been in personal rights. And this reflects, I think, a global story where we've seen for the world as a whole and for the majority of countries, the last 10 years have been a bad 10 years for personal rights moving backwards. And we'll talk a bit more later about how we disaggregate that at a country level. Now, this is, so the EU, there's progress occurring, but I guess the big issue we have to think about is how does this impact against the sustainability debate? And that's really how we're trying to frame this conversation today, is how does growth, progress, and sustainability trade off against each other? And something we've done with the Social Progress Index is actually try to understand this a bit better, try to look at the relationship between sustainability and social progress. So on this chart here, what we've just done is we've plotted all the countries of the world on the vertical axis against their greenhouse gas emissions per capita, and on the horizontal axis, their social progress index score. So countries that are higher up have got higher greenhouse gas emissions. Countries that are further to right have high SPI scores. And the dotted line you see there represents what we understand from literature to be a sustainable level of gross greenhouse gas emissions per capita. And what we see here very clearly, as we know, is that the world is way beyond the level of sustainable greenhouse gas emissions per capita. So that's the problem, and so many of the countries in the world are already unsustainable. And then we can look at how the EU performs on these metrics. And what we see is that the EU is very much clustered at the far end. The EU is a group of high social progress, high greenhouse gas emissions countries. And so the EU countries are clearly part of the problem. Can we maintain and continue a level of high social progress for EU countries while also reducing our greenhouse gas emissions? That's the kind of key policy question we're facing. Well, something we did to inform this analysis was we had a look at all the countries of the world and looked at their performance in terms of social progress and greenhouse gas emissions. And what we saw was that at every level of development, every tier of development, there are some countries doing a much better job than others at producing their social progress while minimizing greenhouse gas emissions. So, for example, for the most advanced countries, Sweden is not at a sustainable level of greenhouse gas emissions per capita, but it's producing a lot less greenhouse gas emissions per capita than Australia. And similarly, Kuwait is producing a lot more than Armenia, Qatar than Ghana, Cameroon and Rwanda, etc. And I think we also see Costa Rica and the US. So countries at similar levels of social progress producing very different levels of greenhouse gas emissions. And so then we said, well, what would happen if every country in the world were as good as the best countries in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions produced to achieve their level of social progress? And what we found was that actually, if that was the case, the world could be actually existing at the current level of social progress within sustainable limits of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this is obviously a hypothetical scenario, but what it tells us is something critical, which is that it is not progress that is the problem. It's the way we are getting our progress. It's the choice of models of development that we've built that have allowed us to achieve social progress while being inefficient in our use of greenhouse gases. It's the choices that we have made that are the problem, not progress in its own right. And what we also see in the data is that there's an opportunity for the EU in particular to take a lead on tackling this problem. Because what we did was we broke these results down for each of the kind of levels of development of different countries. So from the lowest levels of development of countries in tier 6 through to the highest level of development of countries in tiers 1 and 2. And then what we did, we said we looked at the relationship between social progress and greenhouse gas emissions in 2011, the red lines, and in 2021, the blue lines. And what we saw was a very important trend, was that for emerging economies, emerging societies in tiers 5, 4, and 3, we see that there's the greenhouse gas emissions do tend to go up with rising social progress scores. And indeed, for tiers 5 and 4, that process is actually accelerating. And that's bad news. So progress has become more associated with greenhouse gases for emerging economies. But for the most advanced countries in tier 2 and tier 1, what we see is that actually for tier 2, there's a weakening relationship between greenhouse gases and social progress. And for the most advanced countries in tier one, there's actually a negative relationship. For the most advanced countries, they're achieving higher social progress and lower greenhouse gas emissions per capita. And this tells us there's an opportunity for the most advanced countries to really make a lot of progress in reducing greenhouse gas emissions while advancing social progress at the same time. We don't have to choose between progress and sustainability. Inclusive and sustainable growth are actually two sides of the same coin. And then we can pursue the two together, then we can actually achieve both of those goals together. So that's just a bit of the context from what we've found from our data. And so let me turn now to our speakers today to sort of talk about some of these issues. I'm delighted that we're joined today by Jutta Gutteland, who is a member of the European Parliament, a member of the ENVI committee responsible for environmental issues. And critically also, Jutta was part of the EU delegation to COP26 recently. So Jutta, if I could just turn to you, and so from your perspective as a leader in Europe, how do you see that Europe is going to confront this challenge of inclusive and sustainable development?
Thank you, Michael, for inviting me, and thank you for this very interesting presentation. I think you found a very interesting intersection between two, for me, really important connected topics. Of course, the global heating and the climate policy and the emissions, and then the social progress and the social transition that we need to have in our societies. And it was indeed very interesting to see the presentation and how you analyze it and see the exceptional relationship between social progress and greenhouse gas emissions. And I believe your findings are consistent with many other comparisons of different indicators such as HDI and emission or carbon footprint, or the findings from the Happy Planet Index. From a Swedish perspective, I was happy to notice that you mentioned Sweden, and we were also in the bottom left corner with relatively low emissions and high social progress. But it was also interesting to see the point on the European Union, which was a slightly below the fitted curve here. So I took notice of that. We might be on the forefront of climate change policy with the Green Deal, with the climate law, and also with the Fit for 2030 package, but we have not in the EU found the formula to achieve high social progress without hurting the environment. And I think it is extremely important to learn from each other here and ensure that the whole of the European Union embarks on this green transition. I really believe this is a key thing, a key element if we are going to be successful towards the climate neutrality target that the European Union is having as the big target. It was also interesting to see the link between greenhouse gas emissions and social progress, and that it seemed to be weaker for most developed countries. This is, of course, good news in the debate on the absolute decoupling. And we can only speculate in how this causal effects, but it's not impossible to believe that strong welfare society with strong social protection also actually is effective in making the green transition easier to carry through. And it might be that the speeding up of the green transition has a lot of co-benefits, like clean air, strengthen our health and also well-being. And it's clear that these things goes hand in hand, I believe. It is slightly more worrying to see that the medium developed countries do not seem to show this pattern, where the effect of more growth starts to deteriorate on social progress, but keep raising emissions. That will be the next challenge for the world, and to also get the middle income countries on board with the green transition in a just and in a fair way. And I think this is also something that needs to be discussed in, of course, the world meetings like COP and the discussion we had in Glasgow was, of course, a part of this discussion. Going back to the analysis of the EU not achieving so much more well-being per emission unit shows that we need to deliver on the Fit for 2030 package and overachieve our target. This is crucial to rebuild trust within the developing and the middle income targets. The climate finance discussion was at the heart at COP this time, and I believe it is exactly for this reason. The EU might be leading the fight against climate change, but we also need to move even faster between every COP to really build trust and achieve stronger outcome in the upcoming COP, not at least in Egypt next time. And I think trust between countries and trust that we are not only helping each other, but that the countries who have the biggest emissions, that they actually take responsibility to their history and also to the situation that many vulnerable countries is experiencing today, is going to be a key also to have better COP in Egypt and the upcoming COP that we have ahead of us. And I will stop here at the moment, but I find the presentation extremely interesting, and we will definitely analyze it more and see how the European Union can learn from it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's a whole set of points I'd love to come back to you on. Let me turn to Jose Viñals first, though, and come back on. But let me just one comment is, I think this issue around, climate change is a particular problem because it's uniquely a global problem. No country will solve it on its own, and it's therefore a collective action problem as well. And this issue around burden sharing is a key part of the negotiations. I think understanding what burden countries can bear, what opportunities they've got, is going to be very important. And I think some of the insight we've got from this analysis, looking how particularly the most advanced countries perhaps have the strongest opportunity, tells us something about burden sharing. But let's come back to that one. I want to bring in Jose to the conversation. Jose is obviously the chairman of Standard Chartered Bank, but is also co-chair of the UN Secretary General's Group for Sustainable Development. And obviously at COP26, Mark Carney's announcement around the role of private capital in tackling the climate change problem grabbed a lot of headlines. And so it's great to have you with us, Jose. And you were also at COP26 to get your perspective on this, the role of the private sector, private investors in particular, in tackling the inclusive and sustainable growth challenge. Jose, over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael, and hello to everybody else joining in this call. Let me just say that I enjoyed very much the presentation that you made, which I think highlights the value of SPI as a really important instrument that we can have in order to foster the course of sustainable development. And the database that you have and the analysis that you're undertaking, I think, is extremely useful. And I think it can be very useful to the European Union as it continues to move forward in delivering on the European Green Deal. It's about a month exactly, almost exactly, since COP26 started. And I want to start from where you finished, which is that, of course, at COP26, in spite of the fact that it's being criticized from a number of quarters as not providing the sort of deliverables that some were expecting, I think that the level of ambition of the world in terms of climate change has never been higher. And this is something that must be acknowledged, and I think this is good. But then one needs to bridge the gap between ambition and reality. And of course, we all know that coming out, hopefully, of a pandemic which has caused the biggest economic recession in nearly 100 years, and which has left a lot of scars in government public finances, that the need to provide the financing which is needed in order to move forward in the climate change front, and more broadly speaking on the sustainability front, this is something that needs a big heavy lifting on the part of the private sector. And you heard at Glasgow, Mark Carney talk about the commitment on the part of private sector financial institutions, of which we are a founding member of the Glasgow Net Zero Financial Alliance, to commit $130 trillion to fight climate change and to achieve net zero. And it is very important that this is something which is delivered. So I will come back to this in a moment, but let me make my second point, which has to do with the European Union. And I think it's good that we're having this conversation around the role of SPI in the European Union, because the European Union has been leading the pack in recent years in terms of climate change, in terms of legislation, in terms of some regulatory thinking on how to move the needle on this extraordinarily important cause in climate change, and also in terms of sustainable finance. If one looks at the landscape now of the European Union with the funds which are being deployed, those funds are aimed at achieving an inclusive, sustainable, and resilient recovery. So I think that speaks volumes for the attention that these questions receive in the European Union. I would just make one comment, which is extremely important when we think of climate change, to understand the economic realities beyond advanced economies, going into developing economies and emerging markets, which, by the way, are those parts of the world which are going to be most affected by climate change and where finance is most needed. And I think it's very welcome that the European Union is setting up a framework to guide EU capital into those economic realities, which can be really extraordinarily impactful. So we are not talking only about the way that the European Union is acting inside of the Union on its own to foster the cause of climate change, net zero, and sustainability, but also the frameworks that it's creating towards the rest of the world, and particularly to those emerging markets, developing economies that need most capital, particularly private capital, in addition to the official capital which has been promised. But if we think of the transition to net zero and the importance of having a just transition, this is something that requires thinking in a realistic manner of what can be achieved. And of course, we would all like to move from brown to green like this, but we know that we'll have to move in many instances from green to semi-brown, and from brown to semi-brown to semi-green and to green. And this is something that would need to be engineered in a way that helps achieving the net zero goals in the context of continuing to further the economic and social development of emerging markets and developing economies in particular. And I'm very sensitive to that because Standard Chartered is a global bank which has operations in 60 emerging markets and developing economies. We are the main sort of emerging markets global bank. And we have to deal with these realities where you need to reconcile the two things that, Michael, you were saying that can be and should be reconciled and must be reconciled, which are furthering sort of development and progress on the one hand, and at the same time achieving a low carbon economy. So all of that is extremely important, but we need to think in terms of transition and the just and fair transition that Jutta was mentioning beforehand. And that brings me to the second important point I wanted to make, which is that one needs to understand the fight against climate change within the broader context of the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's an area where, again, SPI comes in very handy, because the objectives or the different components or subcomponents of the index are closely related to the Sustainable Development Goals. And the concept of a just transition, of a fair transition, has to do with a number of sustainable development goals being satisfied in addition to the climate change transition, so that the transition is just and therefore is economically, socially, and politically sustainable. Otherwise, there are going to be interruptions. And as an example, in emerging economies like India, 90% of the infrastructure still remains to be built. So this is a fantastic opportunity for the private sector to step in, to mobilize international funds from international financial centers to where it's most needed in order to make sure that the transition happens and it happens in a fair way. And that can happen at the level of financial institutions. For example, at Standard Chartered, we have committed to mobilize between now and 2030, the next 9 years, $300 billion to finance the green of green and transition finance. But in addition to the efforts that we have to make individually, all of the financial institutions to deliver on this $130 trillion commitment of financing, we need to work collectively. And I come back to the point of collective action that you made in your presentation, Michael, because that point of collective action is precisely what we want to achieve with things like the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero or the United Nations Global Investors Alliance for Sustainable Development that I have the privilege of co-chairing. And in that regard, I think, let me just mention a couple of things we're doing in the Alliance. One is we have launched a sort of climate change, Paris-aligned exchange rate fund as a vehicle for investors to mobilize our resources. In the Alliance groups, about between 70 and $90 trillion of assets of the main banks and all the financial institutions worldwide. We have established a platform to provide information about sustainable and green projects, which can be viewed by potential investors, what is in the pipeline, so that the informational asymmetry that we have in terms of financing sustainable projects disappears as much as possible, so that by sector and by country, potential investors have an idea of what are the projects which have been labeled as sustainable and green and certified as that, and therefore know what is the menu of options that they have available for investing. This is extremely important because, as you know, informational asymmetries are a big cause of market failures, and we have had a market failures of not having enough sustainable projects and bankable projects to be invested in. And the third thing we're doing is having platforms and funds being created to facilitate the co-investment of institutional investors in the private sector, but also multilateral development banks and other sort of public sector organizations, so that co-investment can happen in a way which multiplies the power of blended finance. And blended finance, I assume that most or all of you are familiar with that concept, but blended finance is where the private sector financing and public sector sort of help come together, because the public sector can provide, can intervene in a way that helps the risk projects, and therefore you can have a risk-adjusted rate of return, which is very attractive for financing this sustainable project, these climate change-related projects. And let me tell you that the risk-adjusted rate of return of these projects is very good, and therefore once all these things are in place, I think we'll have the opportunity to scale up sustainable finance. And by the way, I think that in the ongoing conversation that needs to be had on blended finance and on impact finance, instruments, practical tools like SPI, I think are critical to foster a good conversation between the public sector and the private sector, both at the national level, at the regional level, like the EU, but also the international level, so that we can better understand the impact of those financings. And what you cannot measure, you cannot manage. So I think it's very important that we have used we use tools like SPI in order to make sure that we're making the difference that we think we can make through our financing. So private sector, very critical, needs to help, but we also need to have the conversation between the private and public sector be also facilitated by platforms like the one I was mentioning before, but also by practical tools like the ones that Michael just explained to us, SPI. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jose. And Jutta, I think that sets up, I think, two critical questions, I think, are coming out. I mean, one is, I think, as Jose mentioned, was like the EU's leadership role in the world. And I'd love to get your reflections on whether the EU is ready to play that kind of leadership role. But then secondly, I think, your perspective on this, the relationship between the public and private sector, finding a solution to the climate crisis has got to be a team game. How do you see that collaboration working with the private sector?
Yeah, I must say on the public sector, if we start there, I think as this discussion about the connection between reducing the greenhouse gas emissions and then the welfare and the social progress in different countries, I think the public sector has a very important role, both in by being a big economic player in the market, and you can politically steer that part of the economy so that you invest in the solutions that will be the future. And the public sector can also be a spider in the net with companies and make sure that together we find solutions that will make it easier to transist. I think from my country, we have big projects today in hybrid is one example that is well known by now. And there I believe that the cooperation between the public and the private companies and the coordination between, and also the means that has been possible to support the pilot project from the EU Innovation Fund and also means from the Swedish state has also been important. So it is, I believe there is many opportunities if you use the public sector in a clever way. But the public sector should not pay for everything. That is something that I believe is an important message too. I think it is very easy to always say, let the taxpayers do everything. And I don't think that will be very effective. We need also to have the private sector be part of the investments that is going to be needed. And if the public sector says we are going to support everything in this transition, I'm not saying that that's the case, but if the will is that, oh, let's open the wallets of the taxpayers every time, then maybe there will not be it will be very easy to use that solution instead of also promoting the private fundings that's needed, and that is also so much a part of the economy. So it will be very insufficient if you work like that. So that is also one of my kind of message, and what I also see happening, and where I think my own home country has some good experience of finding the balance there. Because of course the society should be a very important actor, and it should also invest more, but it should not take the lion part in this. Then it will be very heavy for the citizens. And then on the global actor, I really believe that the European Union can be that global actor. I think this time at COP in Glasgow, it was much easier for the European Union to be the global leader, because we did many things back home that is credibility, that is helping our credibility when we also have expectations of what others should do. It is very clear that if you look at the sectorial legislation, in the European Union, it is, I would say, the biggest region in the world to have sectorial legislation that is so ambitious. And that is, of course, helpful that we have a plan how both to reach net zero target and also very detailed sectorial legislation, how this will be done between the different sectors. And there is very few at this moment who is going under the radar. And even the maritime sector is going to get its own sectorial legislation. Of course, there are debate about how much the agriculture sector is going to contribute. That is maybe a bit of a white spot if you look at the responsibility. But when it comes to most sectors in the society, there is very detailed sectorial legislation, and also now proposals how to make them more effective and reduce emission to at least 55% in 2030. And it's going to be a very speedy process during the upcoming years to make it happen. But it's really rolled out, and I don't think that's the case in so big regions in other parts of the world. On the other hand, the EU has a very big responsibility historically, and to be able to send the message, and that was also very clear at COP, there is still some flaws. And one of the flaws for the European Union is that we and many other global emitters have a very big historic responsibility and also a current responsibility to the emissions that we stand for. And then when you see developing countries suffering more and yet don't have the biggest impact on what's happening, then we also need to discuss climate financing, not only discuss it, but also live up to the promises that the world has set. And also this debate on the loss and damage was very big in COP. And I also believe there that the European Union needs to take this really serious and see what we can do, not to prevent the discussion on the reduction on emissions and the NDCs. Because if we don't clear that part, then we will not be as credible in pushing others in front of Egypt. So yes, to be the leader, we also need to do the homework there. But we definitely changed the game to this COP if you compare to the last ones that I went to with the European Parliament.
Great, thank you, Eugene. I think this point you raise about the taxpayer not always footing the bill, I think also talks this issue about this question about burden sharing and cost and how it's often used as an excuse for lack of action. And there's been a couple of people asking the chat about how do you get countries that aren't taking these issues seriously to actually address climate change. And I think part of the story there has got to be about we've got to stop focusing just on the cost, but on the opportunity. Let me just share a little bit of data with you all, again, just from the Social Progress Index. So this is just, on this chart here, I've just plotted Social Progress Index on the vertical axis and GDP per capita on the horizontal axis. And then we'll just, each of these countries dots as a country, and just pop in the EU countries that are doing best. And so the best performing countries, these are the kind of the tier 1 countries in the EU. Ireland, Denmark, Netherlands, Germany, Sweden, Austria, Finland. And just one comment, broadly for the whole Social Progress Index, we do see that some of the best performing countries in the world are the Nordic countries. And I think some people sometimes think, well, the Nordic countries have got very rich, and therefore they're able to do things around climate action, gender equity, other forms of inclusion. Whereas I actually think the causation goes the other way. That the countries that have become pioneers in social progress and sustainability are the ones who've actually invested, therefore, in their future sustainability. The chairman of our advisory board, Michael Porter of Harvard Business School, in some of his other work, has this thing called the Porter Principle, how environmental regulation actually helps companies to become more competitive. It helps the economy to be more competitive. So if we're looking at the story for Europe as a whole, there's actually a competitive opportunity for Europe to actually invest in sustainable and inclusive growth, not in its own right, but also to continue to drive future competitiveness. So I think for those asking, I think selling that story is that tackling climate change is an opportunity for progress, not a cost, is a really critical one. Let me just, do you want to talk a little bit about the spatial aspects of this as well and the geographical aspects? Just to show you something else is we've been having a look at the EU countries and how well they've improved over the last 10 years. It's quite striking that it's, social progress over the last 10 years has actually been highest in some of the countries like Croatia and Italy and Cyprus. And perhaps, Croatia and Cyprus, as newer members of the EU, you might expect to be catching up. But Italy's shown some quite impressive progress over the last few years. In some of the countries that have shown the least progress, an interesting selection of Slovenia, Hungary, and Sweden. I'm not going to put you on the spot, Newton, but maybe later if you want to comment on Sweden's slower progress over the last decade, I'd be interested to get your perspective on that. I'd like to bring in a colleague now, Pierre Nunt from the London Borough of Barking and Dagenham, because we've done a lot of work localizing the Social Progress Index. First of all, working with DG Regio on an EU Regional Social Progress Index. And then we're working with a number of regions and cities across Europe to localize this even more. And we've done a lot of work around the world on this. Here's an example of some work we've done in the US in Orange County, really bringing the Social Progress Index down to a local level. And PA's worked with us in Barking and Dagenham for about 5 years now, using the Social Progress Index to drive inclusive and sustainable growth in Barking and Dagenham. So I'd love to get, Pierre, your perspective on how the Social Progress, how you have used the Social Progress Index in your London borough to actually drive better outcomes.
Of course. Hello, Michael. Thank you, and hello to everyone else as well on the call. We have been, as Michael says, using the Social Progress Index for 5 years now, something I'm incredibly proud of. It's lovely to kind of be here and speak a little bit about my experience of using SPI to support the sustainability agenda in the London Borough of Barking and Dagenham. I'm the head of insight and innovation at Barking and Dagenham Council. We're an East London borough that serves a population of 214,000 residents, and we are also, unfortunately, London's most deprived borough. And I lead a team of data scientists, behavioral scientists, and service designers. And our team's mission statement is turning data into insight-led action, not too dissimilar to SPI's own motto. And I've incredibly proud that my team has launched our 5th installment of the Social Progress Index just last month, and of course even prouder that the index is really driving action in Barking and Dagenham. We've also mapped our SPI to the Sustainable Development Goals this year, and if anyone would like to have a look at that, I'll certainly paste the link into the chat. And to answer Michael's question, there's really 2 use cases that I'd like to share about how we've used our SPI to further our climate change and sustainability agenda. The first is how we've tackled fuel poverty. Now, when we first launched our SPI 5 years ago, we were absolutely astonished about the level of place-related concentration of fuel poverty, particularly in our town centres. And that actually led us to launch a district heating system in the borough, which that was launched in 2017. And that district heating system now supplies renewable and recycled heat to 10% of the homes in the borough. Now, whilst the 10% figure isn't remarkable, and we've still got a long way to go, it's important that we targeted it to the homes that experience the highest levels of fuel poverty. In the opening video, there was this sort of importance about, tackling the most hard hit areas first, and that was a deliberate policy decision of ours. And of course, being respectful of present company, Sweden does district heating particularly well. In fact, I believe that Sweden went from almost entirely fueled by fossil fuels in the 1980s to around I think in 2017, district heating had become a norm. So we've got some way to go to catch up in Barking and Dagenham, but that particular use case for me was a great example of us as a local authority wanting to tackle fuel poverty, but the solution being one that is pertinent to climate change and the sustainability agenda. So it was a sustainable solution to a problem of social progress. The results are that 5 years ago, fuel poverty in that targeted area was so 32% of households experienced fuel poverty in that particular area. Fast forward 5 years later, that is now down to 11%, and that's in a series of around 4 or 5 years that we've been able to make that level of reduction in the borough. On top of that, I think Jose mentioned really importantly about the kind of public-private financing, and that was also an example of a public-private partnership to deliver these large capital sustainability projects. And I want to make a point about that because when we talk about public-private partnerships and public-private financing, by nature of just how we describe it, one assumes that there is an equal level of funding input into a public-private partnership. The reality is, we in Barking and Dagenham would have not been able to even start that project that led to those particular outcomes had it not been from support from the private sector. So it isn't a match funding where the taxpayer puts in £100 and we also get £100 from the private sector. It's not equal footing at all. And I think there's just an important moment to acknowledge that public, people like myself in public services cannot do this alone. The data and the insight is an important moment to start, but we need every help possible to turn that insight into action. And that's a kind of one fantastic use case that I wanted to share in Barking Dagenham. The other one I wanted to share was a slightly different story of how our building of our social progress index at a local level actually exposed our lack of data on air pollution. Now, in a borough that serves a population of 214 residents, there are only 2 air quality monitoring stations. That is simply not enough. Now, whilst we can do all sorts of wonderful kind of statistical modeling to use those air quality stations and pinpoint where air pollution is at its highest, going back to Jose's point about you can't measure what you can't manage. In fact, the SPI at that time flagged to us that we needed a greater level of detail of measurement. And where this has done really well is this year we decided to remove our paper-based advertising estate. And so those are those kind of big poster billboards that somebody comes along and plasters this great big sheet of paper telling you to buy something. And we decided to replace 55 units across the borough, all paper-based, into a digital estate. And in doing so, we actually reduced the estate now to about 33 devices, digital devices. And in doing so, we reduced the number of visits by vehicle visits, because every 2 weeks somebody has to come along and paste a new poster up there and drive to the next site and do the same. So we've actually reduced the number of vehicle travel by 2,900 trips per year. And by moving to a digital estate, what we've also done is installed air quality monitors in those new units. So we now have an estate that tells us and gives us information about air quality in our borough. And that new data feed is added to, or will be added to our SPI year on year, and it gives us greater granular detail about air quality. So those are two examples, one of which is about tackling social progress with public-private financing and having a sustainable solution. And the second example is purely around having SPI expose the lack of data and coming up with solutions which are also sustainable to supplement the ability to measure. And I shall pause there. Thank you ever so much.
That is great. Thank you so much, PA. And I think the air quality monitors and the advertising boards is a fascinating story, because the way Barking Dagenham used its power of procurement, public procurement, to actually leverage that public-private partnership. And again, back to what you two were saying around resources and financing, I think the lever of public procurement to drive sustainable and inclusive growth is a really powerful one that's probably being underutilized. And I recommend people get in touch with PA because it's a fascinating model. I'd love to come back to Jose and you two very quickly at the end, just to maybe just ask about what do you think is the most important thing to drive a just transition? So to give you a second to think about that, let me just have one just quick digression before we close on the subject of COVID, since we're all, our lives are all being slightly blighted by Omicron. One of the really fascinating findings we found with Social Progress Index this year was looking at the intensity of the lockdown and levels of social progress. And what we found was kind of an N shape. The countries with the highest level of social progress didn't have to lock down hardest, because they knew they had the health facilities to cope, they had higher levels of societal trust. It was the countries that were in the middle income countries with weaker social infrastructure, weaker social structures, had to lock down harder as a result of this to respond to COVID. So actually higher levels of social progress seem to be related to resilience to shocks like this as well. I just wanted to mention that one since COVID's on our minds. But we've got time to finish very shortly, so I'd love to get your final thoughts. Jose, what's the most important thing we've got to do to drive a just transition?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Michael. And I'll be super brief because I have a hard stop on the hour where I would have to disconnect. I think that perhaps it's a combination of things. I don't think there is a silver bullet. If I had to think of one thing, is the need for the action that follows from awareness. I think that the global pandemic has made us aware that these global systemic risks are not just long-term prospects, but may become very tangible daily realities now. And I think that awareness should lead to action. And I think that there is action that needs to happen at different levels. Of course, on the part of the public sector, not so much in terms of the money, but in terms of setting the policy framework for these things to happen in an orderly and effective manner. Things like carbon pricing are probably the most fundamental tool to move the dial, and I'm looking forward to that. but there are other things that can be done. On the part of the private sector, I think we should think both of the financial and the non-financial private sector. The financial private sector, I think that the commercial opportunity will drive a lot of the capital mobilization, and that would be much more effective if it happens in partnership with the public sector. So I think that these public partnership initiatives like the blended finance that I mentioned are important. And then you have the non-financial sector. You have all the companies which have to make sure they undertake the transition plans. I think they would be incentivized to do that if they were subject to carbon pricing. But in the absence of that, I think that the financial sector can apply pressure on those corporate clients in particular, telling them, here are our expectations for you to move down to low carbon economy, and here is our support in terms of supporting you with expertise, with climate change related products that help you advance, and with financing. And when we ask our corporate clients, what is the biggest single obstacle to the transition? They say, we need the financing. So we're there to provide it. And I think there is a fourth key element there, which goes beyond the government and the private sector, financial or non-financial, which are individuals. I think that the net transition to zero will be driven by people's preferences and people habits. And that will be driving the demands that companies have to satisfy. So again, I think that there is a lot of changes in our daily habits that we need to undertake our daily behaviors to make things happen. And again, one might think if there are no sort of policy tools that one can use to promote those better behaviors.
Right, thank you, Jose. Yes, we have enormous power as not just as voters, but as consumers, investors, etc. It's enormous power in people's hands. Thank you. Jutta.
Yes, this is a very big question, and I don't think anyone is able to give the one solution, but I really believe that we will build the society step by step, reform by reform, founding by founding, and it will be also important to do it like that, because then you debate every time, is this the right solution? So that's why the democracies in the world are better in this, because it's clever when you discuss how can we do it so it doesn't make the society more unequal. The contrary, it should actually be a travel that will contribute to more equality in the society. But if I should mention something, I think the one thing is that we should not say that the climate tools should be the social tools, not necessarily. It is two legs. We walk on two legs. One is the climate tools, and they should of course be analyzed so they are clever in their design. But it's important that we have the other leg, that we work on this social just transition, and their high welfare society will deliver better. I'm very sure about it, because then people will not be afraid when we need to put a higher price on the CO2 emissions. So welfare state where you have decent salaries, where you have good schools, that you don't that you don't have to pay too much for the children, where you have tax redistribution system where you actually pay more when you have a higher income, and where you get more when you have lower income. That progressive way of taxing is really clever. And also a welfare with a good healthcare and the good conditions for the society and for the people, that will make people less afraid of the transition. And maybe the most important of all, when the companies need to change, so some jobs will need to stop being there and we need new ones, then we should not have a situation where the workers are so afraid, so there will be very big demonstrations on the street. But to prevent that, we need to make sure that we have strong trade unions that can demand things like good education, economic security system when you get unemployed, so you can educate yourself, so you can get a new job. These kind of building the bridge to the new society for people to walk on, so you don't drop out unemployed. That will definitely help this transition. And this is my message. You need two legs here. One is a very clear climate policy, and the other one is a high welfare state.
I am definitely going to steal that and reuse that one. That's what it. We need to walk on two legs, and these two go together if we're going to move forward. Terrific. Thank you so much for joining us, Judith. Thanks for your contribution. I think Jose had to drop. Thanks to him. Thank you, PA, for your contribution with the fascinating case study. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Stay in touch. Any questions, let us know, and we'll be keeping you all posted as the analysis develops. Thank you all. Have a great day.